third session of the day, and we have so far come across various themes. I think a bit less on labor, though like every other theme they were touching upon labor, but not more detailed studies there. In that regard, we have with us Professor Farzana Afridi. She is a professor of economics at Indian Statistical Institute, Delhi, lead academic of the International Growth Center's India program, and a research fellow at the ISA Bonn. She's currently on leave as a senior visiting fellow at the National University of Singapore, Department of Economics. Her research lies at the intersection of development and labor economics. She works on three themes: gender and social identity, human capital, and governance. Her work has contributed towards designing more effective transfer programs, understanding the role of information in improving health and learning outcomes, and assessing the impact of identity and networks on performance. Professor Afridi has led multiple projects supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that analyze and suggest measures to loosen the constraints women face in engaging in remunerative economic activities. Her research has also been supported by the IGC, DFID, CAGE, the WEAS Fund, UNU WIDER, the Hewlett Foundation, the European Commission, the Planning Commission, and Directorate of Education, India. She is also associated with initiatives to build capacity towards economics research through the Society for Economics Research in India. Today, she's going to talk about an important topic that is shocks and labor use in agriculture, a gender perspective. Welcome, Farzana, virtually, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Thiago, for the very lengthy and detailed introduction. I will jump straight into the presentation, and I just wanted to let everyone know that if they have any questions that is clarificatory in nature, if anything is not clear, please stop me and or put it in the chat, and we can collect those questions, and I'll try to answer them as I present. And of course, for more substantive questions, I'll keep enough time towards the end. So I'm going to talk about two papers that I have worked on, which look at production shocks and labor usage in agriculture, particularly from the perspective of understanding how these production shocks have a gendered effect. When you compare men versus women's labor in agriculture in India. So there are two specific types of shocks that I will focus on. One is to look at technological change. This would be through the effects of mechanization. So this is a work that I have with Munishankar Vishnu, who's my colleague at ISI Delhi, and my collaborator Kanika Mahajan, who's at Ashoka University. And the other shock that we are studying that I'm going to talk about today is looking at extreme weather events, which are expected to, of course, go up with climate change. And specifically, we look at the effect of droughts. And this work is with Kanika Mahajan and my PhD student, Nikita Sanwan at ISI Delhi. So let me first talk about the first paper, which is looking at technological change. So we are interested in trying to understand what is the effect of increased mechanization in agriculture in India on labor. So if you look at this graph over here, on the y-axis, we have employment, and on the x-axis, this is looking at the employment by so on the y-axis, we're looking at employment by female and male labor in agriculture. This is coming from the NSS. And on the x-axis, we're looking at the trend over time. And what you see is that the usage of male labor, engagement of men in agricultural work has been more or less constant, but then you see a dramatic decline that happens, a gradual decline before 2005, between 2000 and 2005, and then a very dramatic decline after 2005 and until 2011. And then we have this other figure, which is showing increasing agricultural mechanization over the same period. So we're looking at the period of 1999 to 2011. And we look at the intensity of usage of different kinds of inputs, machinery that is used, whether it is hand operated, animal operated, or power operated. So we define mechanization in terms of greater usage of power operated implements. And what you see is that there has been almost a threefold increase in the usage of power operated implements over this period, and a very steep increase again after 2005, right? So there are two things to keep in mind then. One, that we are seeing a period of 1999 to 2011 when there is a rapid decline in the engagement of women's labor in agriculture. And this also relates to the fact that during the same period, we observe an overall fall in women's labor force participation in India, which is driven by the fall in rural areas. In urban areas, there is more or less stagnancy. And then this is accompanied by this increased mechanization in rural areas. So the question we want to ask is, what is the effect? Like right now, we're just looking at two different pictures, right? So they're just associations. What we want to understand is whether there is a causal relationship between mechanization and labor use during this period, and specifically whether this mechanization had any gender differentiated effects. Did it affect women's demand for labor differently from men's demand for labor? And given the fact that mechanization is not exogenous, right? Like who adopts power operated implements or does not adopt is going to depend upon a number of factors which are endogenous, in the sense that it would be various unobservables or factors that affect mechanization also are correlated with the gender differentiated use of labor. So we want to establish causality, and therefore we use an instrumental variable strategy to which exogenously determines the adoption of machinery in the land preparation stage. And here we rely on the agricultural literature, which suggests that there is a significant link between the texture of the soil and the deep tillage requirements, which are going to have an impact on the probability that machinery is adopted. I will dwell on this in more detail later. And then we want to understand whatever, if we find any causal effects of mechanization on labor usage and a gender differential effect, then what are those factors which determine those gender differential effects? Why is it that we find and we expect to see that the effect on women may be more adverse? There would be a reduction in the demand for their labor much more than the reduction in demand for men's labor. And why is it that we observe that? Okay, so that's what this paper is trying to do. Now, to give you some background on the agricultural production process and how this paper is set up. So what we understand is that there are broadly three stages of agricultural operations, irrespective of the crop that we are looking at. So at stage one, we are talking about primary and secondary tilling. So there's preparation of land. And in stage two, there's sowing and weeding in terms of, like maintenance of the land and sowing of the seeds. And finally, in stage three, there's harvesting and threshing, right? Now, one of the things that you might want to think about is whether there is differential usage of men and women's labor across these three stages of agricultural operations. Note that in stage one, when you're talking about tilling operation, then that requires more physical labor, right? More physical and effort, which men are more, typically would be able to provide, whereas sowing and intercultural operations in stage two are more of a precision kind of work, because, for instance, if you look at women who are transplanting rice in the paddy, in the rice fields, right? So there is more of precision required there, where women's labor might dominate, right? And then harvesting and threshing, it's not so clear, where necessarily whether you'll have more women or less men. But essentially, that is what we want to think about, that there is some gender differentiation, or requirements might differ across these stages of agricultural operations. And as I pointed out, the usage of agricultural implements across these stages can also differ between hand, animal, and power operated. So if you look at, all of this data is coming from the agricultural input census. So if you look at primary and secondary tilling, what you see is over the same period, the intensity of usage of power operated implements increased significantly in primary tilling. And this is coming essentially from the usage of tractors, which increased threefold during this period. There is also an increase in power operated implements in secondary tilling, but it's really pretty massive for primary tilling. If you look in contrast, if you look at sowing and weeding, which are the stage 2 operations, we hardly see any usage or increase in usage, significant increase in usage of power operated. In weeding, there's absolutely none. And then finally, in harvesting, we do see some increase in power operated implements. But what I want you to take away from here is this massive increase that we see in primary tilling. And this is what we are going to use in terms of our definition of mechanization, of how mechanization in the primary tilling stage of the agricultural operation, what effect it had on the demand for labor in the downstream operations as well, overall, as well as in downstream operations of stage 2, as well as in stage 3. So this is broadly what we're doing. But before we get into what we do, let me give you an idea of what the literature says. Essentially, we know that mechanization, there's been tremendous work which would suggest that the whole idea of adopting machines is to shift away from labor. You want to use less of labor, so it's labor saving technology, and that typically happens when the wages for labor go up, when the cost of labor goes up, and then you're substituting towards a less costly input. There is some evidence that suggests that there's lighter nature of work because of use of mechanized threshers, but this is in the later stage of the production process. But there is absolutely no work which really focuses on what is the overall effect of mechanization on demand for men and women's labor. Generally in the economics literature, you have the work which suggests that technology, adoption of machines, for example, can be disadvantageous towards those who are less skilled, whose skills are less complementary to those machines. But focusing on agriculture in particular becomes very important from the Indian context, given the overwhelming proportion of labor employed in agriculture, and also, of course, more so women. So why would we expect that there would be gender differentiated effects? As I pointed out to you, that if you look at stage 1, right, which is land preparation, then men are involved relatively more because of the physical labor that is required. You require a lot of physical strength to be able to do it, right? And therefore, men will have a comparative advantage. Whereas more women you will observe in the secondary and the third stage of the task. So you can see this proportion of females in plowing, for instance, is the lowest. And this actually doesn't come out so clearly in the NSS data, but if you look at ICRISAT data, for instance, it will show you very clearly, if you look at the plot level data, that the usage of women's labor is the lowest in the early stages of agricultural work. So what we do is, so what we are saying is that, you know, if you have machinery adopted in the early stage, which is the primary tilling stage, then what impact would it have on the overall demand? Why would you expect, you might expect a reduction in the demand for labor in subsequent stages of land preparation, because if machines are doing a much better job of preparing and tilling the land, then the requirement, for instance, for weeding, for land maintenance during the growth of the crop is going to be much less. And this is exactly what we are going to show, that one, men's labor is complementary to the adoption of tractors. Who is driving the tractors? Women typically do not have these skills, right? So at the stage of tilling, when tractors come in, it's not that men's labor is displaced entirely. They are going to use their labor to run that machine. But what happens in the second stage is that because of that preparation of land being much better due to the adoption of machinery, women who are predominantly providing their labor in the stage of weeding, that is where we'll see a decline. And I'll show you those results later. Now, what do we do in order to study this? We look at, compile district level data using a variety of sources. The most important thing for us, the effort that it took was to digitize the soil maps of India, to get detailed idea on the soil texture and so on. We use the agriculture input censuses to figure out what was the usage of implements by these different categories, then the employment from the National Sample Survey, and many other sources. These were all compiled to create a district level data from 1999 to 2011. So to give you an idea, this is what the National Bureau of Soil Survey maps look like. You know, they will give you these various colors and grades in terms of the extent of clayiness, loaminess, the pH, and so on. So all of these were PDF files. And what we did was to convert these PDFs into digitized data set, which was overlaid on district boundaries. So we ended up with something like this. Essentially, what you see here is the map of India. And for each district, what we were interested in looking at is the proportion of soil which is loamy versus the proportion of soil in the district which is clay. Why? Because we know from the agricultural literature that loaminess, when you have more loamy soil, then the requirement for deep tillage is higher. So the probability that you will adopt machinery, if you can, is going to be higher when you have proportionately more loamy versus clayey soil. So this is going to be our, exogenous natural endowment of a district, which is going to determine what is the probability of the adoption, the extent of adoption of machinery in a particular district, which we can then use to look at what is the effect of that adoption on labor usage of men and women overall and at different stages of agriculture production process. So this is basically then what we are following is a two-stage least squares process. So this is our yeah, our reduced form equation. So what we are interested in is, this is labor. LFDST is labor of a female in district D in state S at time T. And our main coefficient of interest is beta 1, where MC is the mechanization in stage 1. Okay, so mechanization in stage 1. And we have a host of controls. We have district fixed effects, time trends. We also control for many other characteristics, which are district level controls in terms of demographics and agriculture characteristics, crop composition, and so on and so forth. We also want to control for initial employment, which is the labor use by gender in 1993 before our period, because that could be reflective of norms around women's labor use. We, as I pointed out, we look at all these weather related and agricultural related factors, what is the usage of fertilizers and the level of development of the district. And which these are all factors which can change over time. So what is our first stage? Our first stage is we have to, this variable is endogenous, right? So what is the amount? So as I said, what is MC here? MC captures the mechanization, right? So the extent to which machinery is being used. And so this is endogenous because we don't know, there could be a lot of characteristics which determine both machine usage as well as labor usage and gender differentials in labor use. So we use this difference in loamy versus clayey soil in the district, which is going to be determining what the extent of machinery adoption is. Okay. So the extent of machine uptake, so why are we using that? As I pointed out to you, that primary or deep tilling is very power intensive, right? It requires deep tillage. So you do a better job when you have a machine to do it rather than if you have manual labor. And primary tilling, there's a host of literature which we're citing here and also in the paper, which shows that primary tilling is going to be, doing this deep tillage is more amenable in loamy than in clay soil. And because it is a higher luminous of the soil, means that you can use deep tillage or plowing implements, then therefore you are more likely to adopt power operated implements. In particular, what we are looking at is tractors, which are used for deep tillage. So when you do deep tillage, then one thing that you want to keep in mind is also that this is going to have implications for the labor required in subsequent stages of the production process. Okay, so just to establish the validity of this IV, this IV is going to be valid if it does not have a direct effect on the amount of male labor being used per hectare. It does not have an impact on the demand of female or male labor. It does not have an effect on the level of incomes, the kinds of crops that are grown, because differences in crops could mean differences in demand for labor by gender. And what you can see is that all of these coefficients are statistically insignificant, which is telling us that our instrument is we can believe that the instrument is valid because it does not directly affect any of these factors which can impact labor usage directly. So we do not find that soil texture affects soil fertility, in the sense that we looked at yields, wages, household expenditure. We do not find any direct effect on these. We also looked at the kinds of crops that are grown, because there is literature which suggests that women's labor is more likely to be used in rice cultivation rather than wheat, and we do not find that soil texture has a direct effect, at least this component, loaminess versus clayiness. And we of course have control for crop composition. And we also address the possibility that there are some norms around women's labor, like you have some, like in the north, typically women are less likely to be engaged in the labor market versus the south, because of certain social factors and so on. So for that, we control for whatever is the labor use by gender in 1993. And so what you see here in the first stage is the very significant effect of luminous on tilling. So overall mechanization, the overall effect on mechanization of luminous is statistically significant at 1% level with a decent F-stat of about 12. We don't want it to be too low. And then what we do is we use that to look at the effects in the second stage. So now we have run the first stage where we have instrumented for mechanization using the share of loamy versus clayey soil, and we're looking at what is the across this period of 1999 to 2011, what is happening to the female labor usage per hectare and the male labor usage per hectare. So what you can see is, so this is districts across this period of 1999 to 2011. And what you can see is that across all these specifications where we control for land size, crop composition, so on and so forth, as the specification becomes more strict and we are controlling for state fixed effects and possibly the fact that there are some time trends, that there is a 1% increase in mechanization leads to about a 2.4% decline in women's labor. But we don't find any effects on men's labor. Is there a question? Okay. Now we want to see that, okay, that's the overall effect. But we said that, how is this effect coming? Where is this effect coming from? And again, because you can see this effect is actually, as we had expected, given the structure of the production process, it is coming from the second stage of the agricultural production, which is weeding. Because that is where more women's labor is being used than men's labor. And we see a decline in the demand for women's labor for weeding. Now, what is happening for men? We do not see any significant effects. As a matter of fact, in sowing, if anything, there's an imprecise increase in the demand for men's labor. But overall, we do not see any change in the demand for men's labor. There's an insignificant decline in the stage of tilling. So what we can conclude is that given our analysis, what we think is happening is that the adoption of machinery is substituting for women's labor in the secondary stage, in the downstream stages of production in agriculture. But it could be that over this period that we are looking at, why is mechanization happening? Mechanization could also mean that incomes of families are going up. And when incomes are increasing, then it is possible that you are going to, there could be a wealth effect, and therefore the demand for women's labor might decline. But what we find is we also break up our analysis by what is happening to hired labor versus family female labor. And what we should have expected is that with rise in incomes, hired female labor should have gone up, right? So hired female labor should have replaced family female labor. But we don't see that. We see a decline in both hired and family female labor. The other is it possible that there's some structural transformation going on? So everybody is, kind of moving to the non-farm sector, and maybe women in bigger numbers are moving to the non-farm sector than men are moving. And then so we looked at the non-farm employment during this period of both men and women, and we actually do not find any change in or an increase in non-farm employment, particularly for women when we look at construction, services, and so on and so forth. So what we can conclude is mechanization has or can have gendered impacts. It depends on the type of technological change that is happening. What is the stage of cultivation at which the machines are being adopted? And what is the complementarity or substitutability with labor, right? So what we find is that a 1 percentage point in exogenous increase in mechanization leads to a 2.4% decline in female labor, which translates into a pretty significant elasticity of demand for women's labor, which is 0.5. Whereas on the other hand, it is men's demand for labor is completely inelastic. Even though mechanization is happening in the stage of tilling, where you would expect that increase, because men's labor is used more in tilling, there will be some displacement of men's labor. But we don't see that displacement of men's labor significantly, because men's skills complement the machinery that is being adopted. The decline that we see in women's labor is driven by the fall in the labor that is used for weeding, because this is the stage in which women specialize. And so there is an overall decline in their labor force in the participation in the agricultural sector. And more importantly, because we don't see any move or reallocation of women's labor from the agricultural sector to the non-agricultural sector during this period, it suggests that women do not have enough avenues to move to shift to when there is a decrease in the demand for the labor in the agricultural sector. So the transition that they should have made from agriculture to non-agriculture did not happen, which potentially contributed to this overall decline that we've observed of about 15% to 20 percentage points during this period using NSS estimates. Okay, so that's the first kind of shock that we were looking at, a shock in the sense of adoption of technology or technological change and how it can have these different effects on the demand for labor. Now, the second kind of shock that I'm going to talk about is again important in the sense that we are looking at climate change, right? And we are aware of the fact that as climate change continues, then the probability that we will have extreme weather events, which are excess rainfall or deficient rainfall, high temperatures, is going to increase rapidly. And if you look at the IPCC report, this is coming from I think not the latest one, but the one that was just before that. We are aware of the fact that global warming is leading to a rise in temperature, and these are different estimates based on the extent of global warming, how much that rise in temperature and these heat waves could be across the world. And these increase in temperatures has been accompanied by increased frequency of these extreme weather events, right? So again, if you look at the number of dry days that are expected, it depends upon what kind of estimates we have, whether temperature on the increase in temperature, by how much the temperature is going to increase is going to determine whether we are looking at the green line or we're looking at the red line or we're looking at the blue line, right? So our most hopeful is the blue line. But what you see over here is that these dry days, the variation that we're going to expect in the dry days is going to go up over all of these countries. And in India, a drought has been reported at least once every 3 years in the last 5 decades. So this is a 5-year moving average of droughts in India between 1901 and 2017 using the Indian Meteorological Department data. And we're looking at grids, not looking at villages or states and so on, grids based on the geocodes that we have of rainfall. And what you can see is that there is an increase in the probability that a drought occurs in a particular grid, and that is increasing over time. So we know that this variability of the weather, these extreme weather events and the climate change is going to affect agriculture much more than any other sector, because more than 75% of the world's cropped area is dependent on rainfall. And in India, we still not there in terms of being of having access to irrigation. Significant proportion of the workforce in India is still engaged in agriculture. And we know that we have gender disparities in employment rates, both within rural areas as well as in urban, but we're going to focus on the rural areas, right? So what we want to understand is when we talk about climate change, and when we are not going to, I'm not going to say that this is climate change per se, but we're going to focus specifically on what climate or weather related shocks can have, the impact that they can have on the allocation of labor and to highlight the fact that there are certain demographic groups which are more vulnerable to these production shocks, to these weather shocks than others. And so policy needs to focus on those more vulnerable individuals in terms of mitigating the effect of these shocks and future, increased frequency as climate change continues. So we use household and individual level panel data over 5 years across 8 agroclimatic zones. And what we want to study is at a very micro level, what is the effect of rainfall shocks, like what we are going to define are droughts, on the labor use by gender. And given that there is, we don't have great data in India on individual labor supply at the season level, at the crop level, but this is a great data set which is from ICRISAT, which allows us to and this is panel, so it allows us to observe the same individual across this period of 2010 to 2014 and see how this person's labor usage in agriculture is changing when they are hit with a rainfall shock. And then again, we want to understand what explains these observed gender differences. And what I'm going to show you is the fact that women, again, are more vulnerable to these rainfall shocks. They are less likely to be able to move or reallocate their labor to the non-farm sector as the farm sector becomes more risky. So when these shocks hit, we know that, for instance, all of us study in agriculture, when you have these kinds of shocks, people are going to migrate, right? You think of droughts and so on. So you have seasonal migration. And what we point out is that women are less likely to do that. Women are unable to migrate, unable to reallocate the labor to the non-farm sector, which means that either they're going to drop out of the labor force entirely when you have these negative rainfall shocks, or of those who are working, you will see disproportionately more women in agriculture, more women taking up these risky agricultural work than men do. Again, the existing literature here does not have much of a gender lens. When we look at rainfall shocks in particular, we are very cognizant, aware of the fact that it is going to affect yield, incomes, and incomes of farm households and their earnings. And we are, why are we focusing on labor in particular? Why we are not talking about other mechanisms to cope with these shocks, such as credit, other social insurance mechanisms, and so on? The reason is because we know that there is market failure, right, in India, particularly in rural areas. Access to credit, access to insurance is very limited. So most often people are going to use their labor to weather these shocks, right? So labor here is the most important assets that most poor people in agricultural areas have. And one of the ways in which they're going to use their labor in order to weather these shocks is through this migration, right? And there is some literature which would suggest that, which has looked at permanent migration, but we are going to look at in particular on unexpected shocks which affect the seasonal migration. So these short-term labor adjustments, there is other evidence which suggests that men may be better placed to take advantage of available coping mechanisms when they have to make these short-term labor adjustments, and women might not have been a advantageous position there. So, for instance, there is one paper which shows that there is no differential impact in take up of non-farm work, though of course we don't find that, but this is in the case of China. But they do find that male urban employment increases more during low rainfall years as opposed to female urban employment. but this is again China. So we don't know much about, many other contexts, many other countries, particularly India. So what we're looking at here is, as I pointed out, the village dynamics in South Asia survey, which is a panel study by ICRISAT. And the ICRISAT region is essentially Andhra Pradesh, Telangana. But that's where ICRISAT is. Sorry, I absolutely said the wrong thing. We're looking across 8 states and 30 villages spread across 8 states, which fall into 8 agroclimatic zones of India. But these are also zones which are more susceptible to rainfall, getting less rainfall because they're semi-arid. And then let me show you the map here. So this is the map. And what you see is these are the different agroclimatic zones in these different colors. And these are the villages which are spread over all these different agroclimatic zones. So essentially, we don't have data from the western Ghats and from the northeast and from the more dry, Rajasthan and the north. But but you can see that the effects might be even larger if you're looking at very dry areas. Then in each of these 30 villages, 40 households per village were surveyed for an entire agricultural year from 2010 to 2014. And they collected very detailed data on employment, cultivation, agricultural inputs, as well as earnings. So this is very, very rich data set, which I would encourage you to look at. It is publicly available. I think it's one of the best sources of data that we have, most disaggregated and most micro in India on agriculture. And it is panel. So it's an individual. So what we do is we create an individual level panel, which gives us employment of about 6,000 individuals across these 1,400 or so households. And you have a rich source of information, whether they are currently employed, whether they're looking for work, what kind of work they're doing, whether it is paid farm, family farm, livestock, a number of days of work that they have done per month, where they're getting their, whether it's skilled, unskilled, if it's non-farm work, what are their earnings, what is the place of work, and so on. Okay, so it's extremely detailed. And then we combine this data set. So we have village level data, right, for individuals we observe in this period. We combine it with IMD data to get daily gridded rainfall data from 1971 to 2015 and match the latitude longitude of the sample villages to the nearest point on the grid. So then what we have is we have variation in the rainfall at the village level. And what we're going to observe is at the village level, if you have a drought, if you have low rainfall, then as an individual, what do you do? And I'm observing you over this 5-year period. And what we are going to define drought as is basically we are focused on the Kharif season, so the monsoon rainfall, which falls in the bottom 2 deciles of the long run average rainfall for a village, is our definition of drought. And we're going to do tons of robustness check, with different definitions of drought. Now, the question is, as I pointed out, is this a good measure? So we check the validity of a drought measure by looking at what effects does this measure have on rice output, rice yield, all crops. And what you can see is that it does have a significant negative effect, which suggests that we have a decent measure of a drought. We also look at labor inputs. So what is happening to the usage of labor during this period? Because you would expect that during droughts, again, the demand for labor is going to go down, and that is exactly what we see. So we think we have a valid measure of droughts. And so because this is weather induced, this is an exogenous event that is happening, we are going to regress a host of labor employment related outcomes on drought. and our main coefficient of interest is beta 1. We're going to run this with individual fixed effects. So any unobserved characteristics of individuals which could affect their employment outcomes is going to be taken care of, because we're going to get rid of it through these individual fixed effects. We have state fixed effects, we have time trends. We're also going to do, sorry, I didn't mean state, it's season fixed effects. So season, year, individual, and so on. Okay, so we are going to focus on this coefficient beta here. So what is the overall result that we get? What we see is that the participation of men in the labor force, which includes whether you're working or you're looking for work, okay, that seems to be less for women. So we are going to look at the difference between female and male for each one of these regressions. And what you see is that the probability that women are employed relative to men falls by 1.7 percentage points. And what is surprising is that women might be working less. They're less likely to be employed, but more women are looking for work. Right? So the probability that they are unemployed definition being that you want to work, but you're not able to find work. So both of these add up to being in the labor force. And you can see that more women are looking for work. So that's on the extensive margin. On the intensive margin, again, the number of days that you actually spend working has fallen. It falls for women, but the number of days that women are spending looking for work is going up. So what is happening? What is happening is because of this shock, there is this demand decline in agriculture. Women are not able to find work. You know, they're looking for work, but they've just dropped out, right? Like they're looking for something to do, but they're not able to find it. Then when we look at, okay, where is this decline coming from? So what I want you to focus on is these two things. If you look at the farm, right, you see that for men, it's negative. They're moving out of paid farm work. They're moving out of the farm sector. So this is paid farm, meaning this is not your own farm. You are working for somebody else on the farm. You moved out now. So that means that not that women have moved in. Women have not moved in. But because men have moved out, the gender differential is positive. Means more women, disproportionately more women you will find now in the farm sector. But if you look at the non-farm sector, what is happening? Where are the men going? The men are going to the non-farm sector. So from the paid farm sector, they are moving to the non-farm sector. And as a result, and there's nothing happening for women. Women are essentially kind of stuck where they are, right? But because of this, the gender differential in the non-farm sector has moved in the opposite direction. So you have disproportionately more men in the non-farm sector than in the farm sector. And you can see the same thing if we look at in terms of the intensive margin, which is the intensity of work, which is the number of days of work, right? So what again, and then what is happening to hours of work? Exactly the same thing. You see that the hours of work, the gender differential has become positive. That is because the men are not only at the extensive margin, not only are they moving out of the farm sector, they're also putting in less time, hours of work into the farm sector and more time into the non-farm sector. As a result of which, there are, again, it's moving in the same direction, which is more women who are working in the farm sector, and there are women and they're not able to reallocate their labor to the non-farm sector. And as a result of this, again, the same differential, what you will see is that the monthly earnings of men from the non-farm sector goes up, right? Whereas nothing, so again, their earnings are shifting from paid farm work to the non-farm work. So what this is suggesting, again, overall, just to tell you what the coefficients imply, is that women are 7.1% less likely to be employed than men as a result of the drought shock, but 80% more likely to seek work in a drought year. So on the intensive margin, there's a 19% fall in women's days of work relative to men. Men are more 23% almost more likely to work in the non-farm sector, whereas women are not moving to the non-farm sector. So either they are dropping out of the labor market, and those who are staying in the labor market are just stuck to the farm sector. So men's non-farm work days increase by 20% relative to women's. And what is happening is that the probability that men take up work outside the village increases. So this is also data that we have, because I showed you the summary statistics, right? We can see what's happening in terms of the distance to work and the probability that you're working outside the village. We find that our working outside the village increases by 7.2%, but then women are not able to move outside the village. So then we do a bunch of, robustness checks and so on in terms of looking at different measures of droughts. We look at village specific trends, add more controls. We also try to, if you're worried that there's a very few villages, there's just 30 villages, we look at the national sample survey data and you can see that we find the same result. So that's really convincing and comforting for us that it's not just the panel VDSA data, but also if you use the national sample survey data, you'll find the same thing, that the non-farm sector sees more men moving in and nothing in terms of the women. Now the question that arises is, why is that happening? And what we think is happening is because of these mobility constraints. And I think some of it is also reflected in the previous mechanization discussion that I did with you, because we see that women are not moving to non-agricultural work. They're not moving to construction and services. One reason for that could of course be that there is lower demand for their work in the non-farm sector. Another could be supply side factors, where because there are certain constraints on their mobility. So we look at where they are locate, where the work location is, and also in terms of uh, whether there are certain kinds of women who are less likely to transition to non-farm work because of the burden of home production, because of safety concerns, and concerns about, we don't want women to travel too far because you're worried about the sexual purity. So what we find is, as I said, the probability that men work outside the village is 1.8 percentage points higher. The fact that they migrate is significantly more than women, and that the distance to work again for men is significantly more. So the probability that women are working within the village is higher, right? So women are kind of stuck to where they are. And why is it that women are stuck to there? Why are they less mobile? And what we find is that, I mean, I don't want to get caught up in all these numbers, but essentially, if you look at younger women, that you don't want them to travel, you're worried about them meeting strange men and so on and so forth. But or if you're married, so you have a lot of domestic work responsibilities, plus if you're a parent, you have childcare responsibilities. What you see is, what these tell you essentially is that, you just look at difference A plus B. Sorry, all of these red coefficients here are telling you that these are statistically significant, right? So these are p values of 0, 0.02, and 0.01. And they're telling you is that younger women who are married, who have domestic work, and those who have children are less likely to have are likely to have fewer non-farm work days. So they are the ones who are not moving, and they're also the ones who are less likely to migrate seasonally. Again, you see all these negative coefficients here, which is again suggesting that the mobility of these women is very restricted. And interestingly, what we do is, when we say, okay, so suppose we provide work to these women closer to where they are, right? Like Narega work is work which is close. So if you can't move to a small town, or look, because non-farm work, what we find in our sample also is outside the village. Typically we find that women are more likely, this is very suggestive, but somewhat, and there's other work that I have done to suggest that women are much more likely to participate in this kind of work which is closer to their home, right? But you could say that, I mean, why are you saying that it's mobility, right? It could be the skills. Women don't have the skills for non-farm sector work. So maybe that's the reason why they're not moving. But what we find here is that it is not the skill which is the reason, because unskilled work actually is going up for men, right? Men are doing more unskilled work when droughts happen. It is not a skill differential. It is not the kind of work that they are doing. So it's not that which seems to be driving the result. The other is, as we talked about, maybe women are not moving. So when I said sexual purity, I did not mean safety concern. It's just that, you have these norms and attitudes that you don't want young women who are unmarried, or even married women, to meet strangers and meet strange men and so on and so forth, because there could be and what we find, but that's a separate thing from social norm versus safety concerns, that you don't want women to go to the town because you're worried about safety issues. And what we did was that we pulled together data on the crimes against women, and we used different measures of crimes against women to find that there does not seem to be any significant, you see all of this difference, A and AB, both of these are statistically significant, showing that it's not safety concerns which seems to be driving this. So let me summarize this again, that the extreme weather events have gendered effects. In context where women's labor mobility is constrained, men find it more easy to substitute to non-farm work, but women are less mobile, and non-farm work, because it is typically outside village. So that again points to the fact that there is some sort of lack of demand, which is non-agricultural work in rural areas. And that again points to this lack of structural transformation that we've had in our economy, where people are moving out of agriculture but are not able to find work in the non-agriculture sector. And this is going to this transition is going to gather more pace, because agriculture is going to become more risky with climate change. So these social costs which emanate from home production and these social norms around purity can translate into lower non-farm work days for these types of women. um, and these are women, so therefore 15 to 20% less likely to move to the non-farm sector, right? So what I've done so far is, I think I'm bang on time. I'm just going to conclude now, and then I can take questions from you. The first thing that we saw was, when you think of production shocks, right? Production shocks can happen because of various reasons. There are two specific reasons that we looked at over here. We looked at mechanization as one kind of production shock, and then we looked at weather shock, which also has an effect on the yields in agriculture. And what we are trying to highlight here is the fact that, whereas most of the literature would talk about labor in a homogeneous sense, it is very important to think of heterogeneous impacts, particularly for those demographic groups which are more vulnerable and have lower access to coping mechanisms when these shocks hit, right? And one would think that mechanization is positive, right? Because you're moving towards using less labor and using more of capital, which can potentially increase the productivity of agriculture. But what we don't focus on is whose labor is being discarded, and are those people able to find alternative sources of employment. And we find here that that may not be the case when it comes to women. And when we look at weather shocks, then again, women seem to be much more vulnerable because they're not able to reallocate their labor to the non-farm sector. And it is a combination of both supply side factors, supply side constraints related to social factors, as well as the lack of demand for work that women can do within the villages, within the rural areas, because of which women are either going to drop out of the labor force, or if they are working in agriculture in rural areas, then disproportionately more are going to be engaged in riskier agricultural work. So what we need are policies that mitigate these production shock risks, and they need a gender lens. So one possible program that gives us an idea of what this could be is providing coping mechanisms through job guarantees, which we know women tend to take up more. But of course, it's also the fact that the design of the program is such it reserves jobs for women. And we know that women are less likely to migrate seasonally, as we've shown also here. And therefore, they're going to stay back in the village. And that is when these kinds of work are provided, right? When you have low rainfall, when you have droughts, or it's an off agricultural season, and so on. But what we want to think more cohesively and comprehensively is that what is going to happen if these extreme weather events become more persistent? Do we have a cohesive, comprehensive policy to address this? And also because when these shocks happen and labor, for example, with COVID, the cost of labor, um, in a sense, cost of many things have gone up, right? And so you're going to engage in production technologies which are going to reduce your cost of production. And when you do that, what impacts could they have? So I think I'll stop here and I'll take questions. Um,
Okay.
Raghu, do you
Yeah, thank
want?
you, Farzana. I think yeah. Tell me. Sir.
No, I'm saying, do you want me to stop sharing, or should I just keep it on in case
Yeah.
some students have some
Uh,
questions? Specific slide.
Yeah, it's fine if the presentation is there. Yeah, if at all there is any specific query in the PPT, you can move easily. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you, Farzana. I think these are like two fascinating papers, I think, and contributing to important discussions around women's employment. And the first one, the second one was more, the people have been talking a lot for many years about push and pull reasons for migration and so on. But I think that the gendered nature, I don't think there are many papers which have this bring out evidence in such detailed manner. The ICSSR data is a wonderful data, and good that it is some important question is being addressed with that. I'll just put some questions have come. I think there is Rahul Kumar Singh has asked a question. He messaged me. He's saying, did you use involuntary unemployment days as looking for work days in ICRISAT data? So I think
Yeah, that's what we define unemployment as. Unemployment means that you're looking for work, but you're not able to find work. So it is involuntary unemployment, precisely.
Rahul, you have, is I think there is an intensive part. There is that which is number of
Yeah,
days.
so
I think.
intensive is, yeah, number of days that you're looking for work. Yeah,
Okay. Fine.
number of days you're looking for work.
Rahul, is that fine? Or yeah, yeah, that seems to be okay. Anybody else have any questions, comments?
So am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, Such a very wonderful presentation and very significant work, ma'am. I am Priya. I am a research scholar at Department of Social Work, Central University of Rajasthan. And in my PhD, I am working on how climate change is impacting the livelihood adaptations among scheduled tribes in Jammu and Kashmir. So, more than a question, I want to seek your suggestion. in a place like Jammu and Kashmir, where my study is happening, particularly in Rajouri district, which is a border district, and like there are no much meteorological centers, and in my district I can find only one agriculture center, which have a few instruments there, but still they are of the view that their tools are able to cover the range of only 8 to 10 kilometer. So in my study, like because I belong to social sciences, and having these meteorological data is very significant to validate the study results and other such things and all. So can you suggest me some alternatives, like how to get such data, or if I take it from meteorological center Jammu, it is like around 200 kilometer away from here, and it's not going to work in this conditions. So like I'm a bit baffled between it. So if you have any suggestions, it
But
will be very helpful, ma'am.
yeah, Priya, are you pointing out that the IMD, for instance, has no data on Jammu and Kashmir?
Actually, ma'am, IMD have two centers in JNK, one in
No,
Srinagar.
don't talk about no, don't worry about the centers. What I mean is that the
Okay.
data set that they put up, that is on their
They
website.
have, ma'am. They have, but for the
Yeah.
particular district, there is only one agriculture department who have few instruments because they are having a project. So like I am struggling a lot to get that such data and all, because
You know, there
whenever.
are other sources of rainfall weather data. One is the Maryland Center.
Okay.
The University of Maryland also has weather-related data on India. The
Mhm.
other is also NASA. NASA has satellite data.
Okay.
Some of these data sets might be useful for you. So basically, these are all online sources. So one is the Maryland Center. You can check it out, and the
Mm-hmm.
other one is data from NASA, which they use. They collect that using satellite data, for example, wildfires, wind direction. I think they have some very detailed data. So we have some PhD students at ISI who have used NASA data, and
Okay.
very often people use either IMD data or they use this Maryland Center data. So maybe you can check these two sources out.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
ma'am. It will be very helpful.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Can I ask a question? Hello.
The voice is feeble. Who is this? Gogol. Yeah.
Google, yeah. I was wondering if in the second paper, if the decision to migrate after the shock is a household level decision. So the female
Hmm.
members of the households are saying and male members are
Hmm.
going outside. And the
Yeah.
other thing, if the droughts are localized, maybe I missed the specification. So could it be a migration from the farm to farm, like from a drought affected district to non drought affected district? So agriculture to agriculture movement.
Oh, okay. So, I think the first point that you raised, that this is a joint decision, I think that's really important. And absolutely, I think you're right that, there could be definitely decisions about labor allocation are going to be made jointly within households. And so it could be that men decide to, move because they are more mobile. So I think the point that we are trying to make is that if you want to think of this in terms of welfare effects, then maybe it is optimal, right? In the sense that men may have a comparative advantage, and therefore they are moving in terms of finding work in the non-farm sector, whereas women may have a comparative advantage in staying back and taking care of the home. But when you think of this not just in terms of a household welfare perspective, but you think of individual welfare, and you think in terms of women's bargaining power, their empowerment, and so on, it seems that you're not allowing them or giving them a choice right? So all that we're trying to say is that it is because of these social norms, and that women have to, bear the burden of domestic work or childcare and so on and so forth, that when you look at the relative returns to them moving to non-farm work or moving outside the village versus the cost associated with it. So we have a little theoretical model in the paper as well, and you find that the costs are very high. And that's the reason why women would find that the returns of staying back would be uh, relatively more. But that has implications for women's empowerment, for their own economic empowerment, right? So but I take your point completely that it might be optimal from the household perspective. The second point that you made about where they are moving. So this is an individual fixed effects model, and we are looking at, because we have we are looking at the type of work that women are doing and men are doing. So you're right that it is possible that they could be moving to some other geography or some other location. But as I showed to you, if you look at this employment, right, it is falling for women, and the probability that they are unemployed or looking for work is going up. So we're looking at the same person over time. We have individual fixed effects, and we are seeing what kind of work that they are doing. And we see that the non-farm work is less for women than it is for farms. So you're right that it is possible that they are doing more of farm work, but also they are doing more of farm work closer to their home. So if you look at the mobility, we see within village, right? This within village differential is again positive. So women are more likely to work within the village, less likely to work outside the village, less likely to migrate, have lower distance to work as a result of these droughts. So they are like, you know, you're coming closer to home when this drought is happening. And it could mean that, you're finding some work within the same village. If you're not able to find work, then you're just dropping out of the labor force. And the nature of the work predominantly that exists within the village is farm. There's very little non-farm work, so they're not able to transition. I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Thanks, yes.
Ansi, has your question? Yeah.
Hi, ma'am. Yes, sir. Thank you, ma'am, for this nice section. Ma'am, I have one question. Like, in the session, you told that there is female are pullback to be in the farm sector and not to the non-farm sector. Can we connect these things to the fact that women education and skill formation, where women is lacking education and due to that skill formation, so they are pullbacking in non-farm sector? So the factor of that.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's why we showed this table, that it is not because of differences in skills. So what we did was we looked at the kind of work that women are doing when droughts happen. So is it that women are taking up more unskilled work relative to men? Are men taking up more skilled work relative to women? Are they taking up, more salary jobs? And as you can see, it's actually the opposite. So it's not that in the non-farm sector, it is because of lack of skills that women are not able to transition, or because of lack of education. Skills, if you think, are correlated with education. We don't find any differentials by education also. And as you can see, more men are actually taking part in unskilled work, and there's no differential by skill. So skills are not explaining what we are finding. That's why we say we're ruling out this alternative, explanation.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Sri Raj has a question. He put it in the chat. I'm reading it out. women have an intensive capacity to manage the home and work activities. So how can we improve skills of women to cater the future demand beyond the conventional rigidities from our society? Can you suggest any policy recommendation like Kudumbashri, MNREG, MGNREG, I think, etc.? Yeah.
Yeah, I think what in my other work that I have done, what we are pointing out is the fact that the norm that women have to disproportionately contribute to domestic work, right? That is what hampers women's mobility, because they can't go very far away from their home because they have to come back to cook and clean and take care of their kids, right? And I think this assumption that women have this ability to manage both household as well as market work is a fallacy, in the sense that women are expected to do both, not that women are great at doing that. So I think it's time that we started accepting the fact that the burden on women is double the burden on men, right? Precisely because they're expected to balance both. And I just think that, the reason why we talk about wealth effects, or that women dropping out of the labor force, you could even think of that as welfare improving, is precisely this reason. It's like, why should women necessarily go out and work and get low returns for their labor and then come back home and also do the cooking and cleaning, right? So when you have these possible incomes of households improve, then Claudia Golden's hypothesis is precisely that you see a U-shaped relationship between women's labor force participation and GDP per capita. Women are going to drop out of the labor market because they're not going to take up useless work, right? So I think the fact, instead of us saying that women have great capacity to balance both work outside and inside the home, what we should say is men need to take up more work inside the home to share an equal burden. So I think what you are suggesting about Narega is precisely what we were showing. We showed here that these kinds of programs which give women access to work, which is close to home, which is flexible, which doesn't require them to travel long distances, can address or provide these coping mechanisms to them. So unfortunately, of course, we see that Narega is not getting as much attention from policymakers, and so we are left with nothing much right now. Yeah, I don't see any big national program coming up. So that's why it's important to talk about these issues in terms of cohesive and comprehensive policy interventions. I hope I answered some of that question, but sorry about pushing back a little bit on women being great on both. Women would actually probably be bad on both fronts because they have so much to do.
Yeah, if Sriraj, is that okay or? Okay, fine. Yeah. That was necessary. I think, yeah, that's another important perspective that we need to bring in our analysis. So, any questions? Anybody else has a question? You can put it in the chat window or raise your hands. Again, okay, given that it is bit of in line with capacity building, so I just wanted to ask this instrumental variable thing. And again, as you tried it out and to bring in the validity of IV, how do you, like, how did you argue it out in terms of, one of the things you showed was this thing that about it being unrelated to the dependent variable, right? Is there any other test, like, that is enough, or is there anything else we should look for?
No,
not for
unfortunately,
this. Yeah.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the thing with IVs is they're a leap of faith in some sense, right? The only thing that we can test is the first stage. Your first stage is strong enough or not, whether your instrument is significantly correlated with the endogenous variable. Now, the other part of IV validity, which is whether you meet the exclusion restriction, which is, but that it doesn't have a direct effect on the main outcome that you're interested in. One has to just use the data that we have to show that that is the case. And that's what we try to do. But as I said, that because that is not testable, right? We know that always, and you could always raise a question about an IV saying that, oh, I think it is going to have a direct effect on
Yeah.
some Y, and it is not going to not it's not truly exogenous. So this is in the spirit of a lot of instruments which have looked at, for instance, slope. We have papers by Duflo and so on using slope for dams. We have papers which have used slope measures to look at the effect of electrification on men and women's labor force participation. So grids came up first in those areas. This is in South Africa, where the slope was flatter because the steeper slopes required higher cost. So those grid lines came later. So the author was using the slope as an instrument. But then you could argue that places which are steeper have somewhat different labor market, right? Versus areas which have flatter slope. So, but that's an AER paper. So all I'm trying to say is that it's all a matter of, it's a leap of faith, and you have to push your case using as much data as possible, because people are going to ask you questions. Oh, but it can have this direct effect, it can have that direct effect. Can you use your data to test and show me that it does not have a direct effect, that it is valid, the exogeneity and the exclusion restriction is being met? And that's the best that we can do as researchers. You can't just say that this is an IV and I'm going to use it. You have to make the case for the IV. So use as much data as you can to show, look, I'm showing you here that this variable does not directly affect the Y, does not affect anything else which can have an impact on the main outcome that I'm interested in. And that's the best that we can do.
Okay. Okay. And any questions? We have time for maybe one more question. Fine. In that case, fine. I think, Farzana, thanks a lot for agreeing to give this talk and being here. And I think time you have set some kind of a template, the 1.5 hours, how to go through this, navigate this 1.5 hours for every speaker. Thank you for agreeing. And I think it's evening there, right?
Yes. But just in time for, almost in time for my dinner. So thank you so much, Thiago, for inviting me. Happy to answer questions. If the students have any questions related to data and so on, they can drop me an email. And good luck to everyone with their PhD. And thanks once again for having me. I enjoyed the questions and enjoyed the interaction. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Yeah, bye, Farzana. Thank you. Yeah, participants, we'll meet back at 4 o'clock for a session on climate change by Kavi Kumar. So thank you for